Racehorses is one of the biggest money laundering fronts that you can have because you can buy a horse for $10,000 and then you can establish a value that's $1 million. Starbucks is a bank, 5 or 6 billion in assets. That's bigger than 85, 90% of the institutions in this country. I once talked to a large institution who was doing a secondary fraud review. She looked at 15,000 wires every week. We're financial fine creditors.
Welcome to The Edge for Tomorrow. Today, I'm joined by Justin Fisher, CEO and co-founder at RiskOut. Justin, thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. One thing I love to ask founders, especially with a very robust background in fintech, banking technology, compliance, what were some of the pivotal moments that really just come to mind when you think about why you started RiskOut, why you started your own company?
It's a great question. Just a little short background. I had thought I was going to be an attorney, all my life, and then fell into technology in my high school years. And oddly enough, ended up founding the first company at 19. So I was pretty young, and opinionated, on how things should work. And, I think what's interesting about business, right, is a lot of times these, especially a corporate environment or, a larger environment, it's a meritocracy, right? So how good you are, it sort of dictates your influence, right? And, I was just a very sort of like brash young CTO, right? Or, kind of lead in the space. And so, it was a really good learning experience, of what would I do differently, both personally and for starting my own company. What's the kind of culture? I've seen a lot of things. I'm sure everyone has, right? I think the first really 10 years of my career being in startups, being in larger corporations, having some of those exits where you see both, where you start from 5 people in a room to, 1,000 people in a corporate environment, really kind of shaped where you are. I kind of always use the mall map as an example, right? Like you are here, right? But if you're in a startup, you're on the early stage of that map, right? If you're in the next phase, where you're in growth or you're even in sort of long-term growth, there's a different set of circumstances, there's a different set of skills, right? And a lot of executives don't really make the jump all the way through, right? And so it's interesting to see those different perspectives and then now get a chance to kind of clear the decks and do it again, right?
So tell us about what you're doing at RiskOut.
So RiskOut is a company that you wouldn't see in the front very often, right? Because what we do is we supply software to banks and credit unions in this country, which there's over 8,000 of them. A lot of people don't realize that because they just see a Bank of America or Chase, but most institutions in this country are what we call Main Street institutions. My family are fourth generation farmers, in South Texas. It was a Main Street institution that gave us the loan. It wasn't a Chase or Wells Fargo. And nothing wrong with those, but they're different types of banking relationships. These are people who you see at the grocery store in the community who make your loan, right? Who know your farm is producing, right? So we sell or provide a solution that finds financial crime. So we are an anti-financial crime solution. So that includes things like fraud. That fraud could be, impersonation, people trying to steal money from you. We see a lot of romance scams. It could include that cousin that's taking grandma up to the teller window to take money out, right? That's elder abuse fraud that you typically see. All the way to, advanced money laundering, like you might see in shows like Ozarks and at The Accountant and things like that, where there's, the effort to conceal the source of the cash, right? That's an illegal proceed. And one of the most fascinating things, we started in the cannabis world, which is an interesting, world if you mention that in front of bankers and anybody else. And really, it was about an automatic assumption that it's an illegal product, which is technically still federally illegal. But most people who are growing in legal states are following all way more rules than say a company that's buying racehorses. Why did I say racehorses? Racehorses is one of the biggest money laundering fronts that you can have. Why? Because you can buy a horse for $10,000 and then you can establish a value that's $1 million and then sell that horse, therefore creating a way to launder money. Similarly with wine, like antique bottles of wine, and art, because it's subjective, right? But the point is there's no heavy tracking and receipts process for those things, like there is some of these other industries. So we really focus on helping institutions who are, as you can imagine, one person wearing multiple hats in a small company, small bank, and they do know some of their members and their customers in the industry in the area, but this new person moves in and they want to send $100,000 wire to some country. Many times some of the scams are, you may be totally innocent, but you think you're working for a company who you saw on the side of the road that said made $5,000 a month, and what it is they've duplicated a real company and they're moving money, ill-gotten proceeds through your
Oh,
account because you've been a member at the bank for 15, right? So it's those kind of things that we're identifying and trying to help people, first focusing on the institution, but really it's by extension their community, right? Trying to find the bad guys in the community. So we will ultimately work with the FBI or local law enforcement or something like that. So it's a fun place. We're financial crime
yeah,
fighters,
sounds like
I
a
should
good
say.
show. I would watch it. Uh,
CSI.
why is this problem and the solution you're providing with AI and machine learning, why is this something that maybe a smaller fintech is pretty well equipped to take on and be successful at, maybe versus a larger, more established company?
Yeah, I would say, a more agile fintech has two different things going for them. They probably don't have the volume of existing transactions when you get customers and existing volume, you're having to monitor and manage that, make sure all the wires get out, make sure all the transactions get done. And that takes away from your time to build new things to monitor, right? I once talked to a large institution who was doing a secondary fraud review. She looked at 15,000 wires every week, and she used a spreadsheet and she sorted it by the largest dollar amount and really only got through maybe 100, right? So a fintech could look at that and go, hey, I could build a tool, right, to really identify and segment and group these different things and be able to get to thousands of them or all of them, right? But if you don't have time, it is for everybody, right? You think, oh, if I just template this, or if I just build this tool, or if I use AI and code something, I could make my life that much better the next 10 times I have to do this. But if you're busy, you may not be able to put that time in that automation. So I think fintechs have the ability to use technology in these ways, especially with AI and ML, where I guess the other thing too is we see in larger institutions they don't have data democracy, right? The term being data openness. So there's a great IBM commercial that's going around with two ladies walking down the hall, and one says, hey, well, we have AI but it just doesn't work, and the other one's like, well, it doesn't connect to our data. Well, that's the point, right? You can use ChatGPT all day, but it's going to give you advice based on a public model, not necessarily around your notes, your data, your situation, unless you prompt it very heavily with that, right? And so I think a fintech has a more ability for data democracy, more ability for technology, and they're more motivated, I think, in that way. I'm a technologist from the beginning, a CTO, so I'm constantly looking at um, ways to automate. I'll tell you one real fun example. So we use DocuSign. We send contracts out through DocuSign. One of the little ankle biters for me is that we get NDA requests. I have to do NDAs for all our prospects, so they have to review our financials and stuff. Okay, well, DocuSign, it's not that bad. It's 10 minutes. I put the name in and send the template and what have you. But I recently ran an automation now where my sales rep, without giving them another account to see DocuSign, can do a full NDA process through an automation network, through a tool that also has AI in it. So what that allows them to do is do it without me ever being involved. But the interesting thing about it is I had to use a different provider that wasn't DocuSign, because DocuSign's ability to open up that data, the APIs, was very difficult. It probably exists. It was just so difficult for me to get through. I did this other thing in 10 minutes and it's up, and I pay next to nothing for it. So I think the newest technologies are starting to embrace that ability to be more open, provide more APIs, provide more data access, provide more AI linkage, right? And automate. And so that's where my mind sits every morning is, what are the things I can take off my
Yeah, I
plate
hope
through
that can
automation?
democratize a little bit of the business, seeing how quickly fintech, other small, smaller technology percentages of the whole market are multiplying, especially just in the next few years, right?
You know what's really interesting about it, Tracy, is that I think a lot of business owners don't take the time, and I think this is what's going to be interesting, is take the time to sit down and think about what are the things you do every day, and are they necessary? I say that's really important. Like, okay, so I want to automate the 20 things I do every day. Should they be automated? Should I even be doing, right? Like think about that for a second. It's like, should I be the one in between the NDA process, or should I delegate that? Should I just automate a simpler way to do that? And the tools we're using and the infrastructure we're using may be creating most of that headache, right? So can we do it another way? And that's maybe my greatest, like, happiness about a startup, is that if we want to do it another way, I don't have to go ask IT. I don't have to go through some Microsoft 365 big change, SharePoint.
Well, I'd love to talk about how you evaluate partnerships. How do you approach potential banks or fintech partners, being in such a compliance heavy space?
It's a good question. So let me just give you a little bit of background. We are, if you think about 100% of the configuration has to happen when risk out gets installed, 75% of it is getting access to the data and making sure that's working correctly, right? So let me give you an example. If we're going to look at transactions, we need to know these are checks or cash or whatever. Well, that comes out of the bank's core systems, what they call it. In our general industry world of ERP, that would be the core financial system, right? That's what a bank has, that manages every penny that you have in your account. There are 87 different cores out there. At Q2, we supported all of them. Risk out supporting the majority of them, but new cores come up and we've got to work with them, and that's a new partner. And it's really interesting because if you're the core system, you're like the house, right? Yes, there's plumbing and electricity, but you're the house, right? You're this big structure. So what's a priority to you? And so I think the biggest thing for us is, yes, their customer is a priority, but until risk out has 15 to 20 of those customers, risk out's not a priority. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like we're really new. And so my goal is, every time we kick off one of these new partners that has 200, 500 institutions, is to reach out to them. And actually, this is interesting, it's novel in a lot of cases, because most fintech providers are like, that's a waste of time, I'm not going to do it because it'll take forever, and it does take a long time. But if I can reach out to them with referral business, with paving the path for the data, and showing them that most importantly, I'm not going to throw them under the bus in front of the customer. Because here's what happens: a customer buys a product in banking. I'm going to be very specific to banking. They buy a product, lending. It could be rewards checking. It could be risk out. Compliance, BSA. Okay, they buy it and they've seen this beautiful demo. But most of those providers have an asterisk that says, if you can't get me the data in this way, then you don't get that feature, and they still have to pay for it. And so what ends up happening is this place where the institution, the banker, who's just wanting a solution, right? Who's in their community, who thought they were getting what they did, put their name on the line with the CEO to sign the contract, only to find out that the provider's like, that is your core data. And the core is like, that is your provider. And so they're literally sitting in between the two fingers being pointed. And so we are trying to not ever put them in that situation. Sometimes it's hard because there are relationships on the other side that aren't that interested in being open and working with someone like us. But we try to demonstrate by example, right? Be very open, be capable. If there's a question, we try not to put the institution in between. And so the more we can answer that and sort of pave the path between the two providers to provide them what they need, that's the success point, right? What's even better is being a new vendor. If one of these cores has 300 to 400 um, institutions, then it helps to boost risk out's reputation. The biggest hardest thing for us in our market is not that our product doesn't work. It's great. It's like way better than the existing guys from what we hear. However, we are the new one. We're the new system in a back office compliance person's role. Of the general mentality is like a Who Moved My Cheese, if you're familiar with that book. It's like, ooh, I have to change. There's risk, there's effort, there's money. I'm just going to stay with my current provider, no matter what the issues are. Right. And so we're fighting that. And that as we start to really grow, and we are, this year was a huge growth year for us. Next year, then you start to get to a critical mass where people don't even, they're like, I already get it. These guys are great. They work with someone just like me. But there's kind of a mirror effect, right? An institution that calls us wants to know, where's another financial institution our size, right, that uses our systems, so we can make sure, because we believe you guys, risk out, can provide it, but we don't know how you're going to work with our core. We don't know how you're going to be with someone our size, right? And I think that's a lot easier for us to answer. But when our product was new, you had to kind of rely on your early adopters, your beta customers, to really not only make you better, but also sort of be that like good housekeeping stamp of approval. Like We love these guys. They're great. And I think the biggest thing, the biggest differentiator for us is that we're responsive. We're faster and responsive. So give you a perfect example. If I'm an institution, and I just talked to you actually yesterday, and she says, "Hey, I've got a problem in my current system." The top 800-pound gorilla, right, in the market. And I said, "What's the problem?" She said, "All my cash transactions are coming over as check when they come in through this way with the teller." And the reason that's an issue is because there's a cash compliance requirement. So when cash comes across, you have to report it to the government on certain levels, what have you. You have to do different things. Well, if you don't know that cash is coming across because it was like a combination deposit, then it's a problem. Well, that provider's been pointing fingers at the core's been pointing fingers at the provider. And so for us, we're like, okay, look, we're not going to solve that issue necessarily directly because it's a data issue, but we could map it differently. We could provide flexibility. We could be different in the way that we respond in our technology than to just point fingers and say, idealistically, it should be fixed in the core, put in the middle, right? And so we're really, really focused on that. So back to your original question, we really evaluate our partners based on, you know, obviously the institutions we're working with, we approach their core partners, but also just a general level of enthusiasm and openness with working with a company like us that gives their institutions a better option than the traditional providers. That's probably the number one thing. Are they enthusiastic? Are they like, yeah, you know what? Fill out this NDA, fill out this agreement. We'll see. We got, sometimes those partners for us are a little bit like, they're like a Costco or Sam's. And we're like the new product, the new
Yeah.
beef jerky, right? We're the best. But you're not going to get them to like put that on, like really promote you. Now you can hire, one of those lovely ladies that does the
Right.
samples every week, right? To do that. But like you have to work hard to get it to get them to pay attention. And then once people start, rushing to it and buying it, then it changes, right? But the hardest part is the initial, okay, we got a product in there, but how do we get alignment on the enthusiasm around it when they've got 100 other things to sell or do?
I'm really hearing that translate to metrics and what counts. And in sales, sometimes it's a lot about numbers. Is there any metric?
Yeah.
What metrics are you most focused on when you're looking at your sales process?
It's a really good question. So when I left Q2, I did some scale consulting. So the definition of that was essentially companies who were in growth that were heading to an IPO or an exit. And I will tell you the number one problem. I could guess the problem before I ever reached the organization was that I like to use a restaurant. You'll hear a lot of analogies from me, Tracy, but I like to use a restaurant. So if you go to your favorite diner on the corner and Flo is writing up your receipt, I mean your order, she knows you when you walk in. You don't even have to tell her you want your eggs over easy, right? And then Joe's on the griddle and he's cooking it perfect for you. You love it, right? So why not have some investor come in and open up 100 of those, aka Denny's or Chili's or whatever, right? Well, okay, that experience you're having is based on the people there that are delivering it, right? It's not necessarily a formula. And so what ends up happening is companies get successful and then they duplicate these restaurants and they fail. Or your auto mechanic, because your auto mechanic is the guy and he's not used to scale. But one of the biggest problems with that is your sales team is the one that defines the sales and marketing kind of define the menu. So imagine this: the staff knows what's on the menu, and then somehow the sales guys decide that sushi is selling really well, but they don't tell anybody. So they sell a bunch of sushi. So people walk in with their sushi coupons, and you're like, "Uh oh, we don't even have that much fish, right?" And to me, that is the epitome of a well-run business. Is look, we have a procedure, and that is we're selling fish. But if something changes, sales sells something different. You lose some of your staff. You don't have the right supply come in. You expected steak and you got ground beef. You have to make changes, and you have to empower people in those groups to change the protocol, right? And to adjust to have a soup special. And the chef goes out and walks out and puts a chalkboard that says soup special on the front, right? Because otherwise, you stick in a situation where you have these very hard methodologies, and you can't adjust.
What trends do you see in how fintech and banks collaborate, especially small banks collaborate, moving into 2026?
Fintechs basically have come into the space, 15 years ago in a perspective kind of like a Chime or Acorns, where they're like, look, we can be a better bank. The Twitter founders have founded a bank called Simple. way back, and their first things were like, hey, we're going to make it where you don't have to wait on your money. Well, the problem is that they run into compliance, right? You do have to wait on your money. If you want an FDIC account, you have to run through the Fed. There's requirements in the infrastructure that we're in. But with stablecoin and crypto, that's starting to change. I think the interesting thing is that fintechs kind of pursued banks to do what we call sponsor. So if I'm Chime or Robinhood or Justin Savings app, I have to go and get a bank to underline write my accounts. But I can build a technology on top of that that's a better experience, right? And we call that fintech to bank sponsorship. There's been a lot of downsides to that. There's been problems with those companies going under or not properly managing the money. But generally, that's a possibility. But the banks in the fintech's mind take way too long to serve them, and they have their own compliance issues and requirements, which is necessary. So what I think is probably evolving there is that fintechs are starting to work maybe more incubated inside of the bank or working more in partnership rather than be two partners, providers. They're working as really like solid, founders together, right? I think you're going to see a lot more of fintech being implemented and rolled out through institutions. Um, the only challenge is they're good at banking, they're not necessarily good at technology, right? And the fintech's good at technology, not necessarily aware and clear on banking, right? And so that's where more and more is changing. But the other part of it is something we call embedded finance. So you know, Starbucks is a bank. I mean, you don't think about it, but they're a bank. The way that they load their, I mean, I think I looked at the other day, it's like 5 or 6 billion in assets. That's bigger than, I don't know, 85, 90% of the institutions in this country. So they're an institution, no matter how you look at it. But they're not necessarily following all the same rules, right? And compliance and requirements. And so embedded finance, where it's something like, hey, I've got thousands or millions of transactions, and I'm going to make it easier and better, and take off the credit card fees or whatever I'm going to do, but I'm going to manage that more financially for my customers. I don't know if you ever use QuickBooks, but I get a message probably once a month where they're like, "Hey, we read your incomings and we looked at your outgoings, and here's $100,000 loan. Click here and we'll deposit it in your account." That's a bank. That's what banks do, lend money, right? But they did it through a technology initiative because they're watching the account and they've determined the risk, right? That's that's the thing that you don't think of. You think, oh, we're going to see another big Chime or we're going to see another big like online bank. Yes, we'll see that, but like the things that are really moving the needle are the things that are embedded in your everyday applications, you know, and the way that you process money. Think about QR codes, right? They changed everything during the pandemic. Now QR codes are really prevalent, right? They solved the thing. Think about whether stablecoin or crypto could change how fast you get money by just replacing that card that you're pulling out of your wallet that now has a 3.5 to 4% rate. And so people get frustrated with that and they'll go, oh, I'll use a QR code and not pay the fee, right? Take a picture and be done. Or Apple Pay on your phone, right? Those are things that are changing that we tend to look for the bigger examples, but I think it's the smaller things that you're using on a daily basis. It's really exciting to be in a startup environment that we are in at Risk Out, where we're solving this financial crime problem. We're able to leverage technology that large companies, technology that gets us to the same result that large companies are having to invest heavily in. We are pushing really hard on the automation and machine learning and AI level. Even code wise, I mean, we don't have to hire as many developers, and we can really scale the business faster and better in a traditional market. What's important going forward is staying with our culture, finding partners who are enthusiastic and match some of that culture, and really not putting our customer in between a finger pointing situation, right? Helping to solve the problem so that the happiest part of their day, fintech's going to come and go in different waves. Things are going to change. AI is going to come and go in different waves, but we're going to focus on those core tenants.